Hey guys, welcome to another photography lesson. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about shutter speed. If you watched the first video, we talked a little bit about the exposure triangle, and shutter speed was one of the things that we talked about. So today we're going to get a little bit more in depth. So just a reminder of how the shutter actually works. You have your camera, and at the back of the camera, you have your sensor. Your sensor is what records the image. In front of your sensor, you have the shutter. When the shutter is closed, no light is getting in. When the shutter is open, it lets light come in through the lens, hit the sensor, record your image, and when your image is finished being recorded, the shutter closes again. We talked a little bit last time about how the length of time that shutter is open affects different things. So just to summarize really quickly, you have your sensor, you have your shutter. If it's open for a very long period of time, you're going to see motion. All of this motion that's happening right now in a single image gets recorded as blur. If your shutter speed is very fast, so it's only open for a very short period of time and then closing again, that's great for stopping motion, but it also lets in a lot less light. So then you're contending with a darker image. So let's talk about shutter speeds. They range on cameras from about 1 minute long to about 1/4000th of a second. Some cameras have longer and shorter shutter speeds than that, but that's just an average. So shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second. Typically you'll see 1/ and then a number. What that means is, say for example, if it's 1/60, that your shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So let's start with the very fastest shutter speeds. Let's say up around 1/4000th or 1/2000th of a second. It's going to be extremely fast. So the benefits to a fast shutter speed like that is that you are going to stop all motion. You're not going to get any blur whatsoever, even with a really fast moving object. Like, say for example, if you are watching race cars, you're going to need a super fast shutter speed. You'd also use a really fast shutter speed like that if you were taking pictures of really fast moving animals. So racehorses or cheetahs or eagles, things like that. Of course, the downside to having a super fast shutter speed is that shutter is open for so very little time that there's not very much light coming in and hitting the sensor. You're going to end up with a dark picture. Going back a little to the exposure triangle, you can adjust your aperture and your ISO to compensate for the super fast shutter speed, but still you're only going to want to use shutter speeds like that in bright, open sunlight. So let's talk about slightly slower shutter speeds, like say 1/500th of a second or 1/250th of a second. A shutter speed like that is still going to stop most of your motion except for the most extremely fast motion. So if you are taking pictures of, let's say, kids playing or animals playing, like kitty cats, 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second is a pretty good shutter speed for most normal action. Another thing to note is that if you are taking pictures with a zoom lens, you're going to want to up your shutter speed as well. I always liken it to a ladder. If you're standing on the bottom rung and someone wiggles the ladder, you're not going to feel it very much. But if you climb all the way to the top of the ladder and somebody wiggles that ladder, you're going to sway like crazy. Imagine that in a zoom lens. If you're zoomed out to, let's just say, a focal length of about 18 millimeters, and you are moving, because we always are, you're not going to see it very much. But if you're hand holding and you're using a telephoto lens and you're zoomed way out to, let's say, 300 millimeter focal length, then your tiny little bit of motion is going to be amplified like crazy at the end of it. So in order for that not to result in blur, you really need to up your shutter speed. A good rule of thumb is that your shutter speed should roughly match your focal length. So, for example, if you are using, let's just say a focal length of 250 millimeters, you're going to want your shutter speed to be at the very least 1/250th of a second. Let's talk about an average shutter speed. I'm going to use 1/125th of a second as an example of an average shutter speed. It's a pretty good place to be. It's fast enough that you're going to be able to hand hold it. You can use a little bit of telephoto. You can take pictures of animals or things that are moving just a little bit. But you're still slow enough that it's going to let lots of light into your camera. It's still on the fast side, so you're still going to want to use it in brighter conditions, but it's a lot more forgiving. And I feel like it's a really good best of both worlds kind of situation. Let's call it the ideal handheld shutter speed. Now, if we go a little bit slower than that, let's say 1/60th of a second. 1/60th of a second is widely regarded as the slowest you can handhold your camera. When you're holding your camera, even if you're holding it nice and close, tucked in, elbows in, holding it tight, you're not really a shaky person, you still are moving. There's always motion. So if you go any slower than a 60th of a second, usually, you can see that little bit of motion. It just results in soft, fuzzy lines instead of nice, hard, crisp lines. It's especially noticeable when your subject is also alive and might be moving a little bit as well. So again, if you're hand holding your camera, you're not going to want to go any slower than a 60th of a second. If we slow it down even further, let's talk about 1/30th of a second. That's pretty slow. It sounds really fast, and when you take a picture at 1/30th of a second, it's going to sound really fast to you, but it's not. It's not as fast as you would think. So you're going to get all of the blur from holding your camera and moving, but also if your subject is moving at all, you're going to see that blur as well. But what it is really good for is if you have a moving subject and a pretty steady hand, you can actually track that moving subject and create the look of motion blur. So motion blur is exactly what it sounds like. It's blur created by motion. So let's say you wanted to take a picture of a motorcycle for an advertisement, and you wanted to make it look like that motorcycle was moving. If you have your camera set to a slower shutter speed, like for example 1/30th of a second, and you are tracking the motorcycle, and you keep the motorcycle in the exact same place, or as close as you can get it to the same place, in your frame, and you move with the motorcycle, what's going to happen is the background behind the motorcycle is all going to blur in one direction. That's motion blur. It's good motion blur because it gives you the impression of that motorcycle moving really, really fast. But the motorcycle itself, if it's done right, should be nice and crisp and clean and not blurry. It's a fairly easy thing to try at home. Set your camera to a slower shutter speed, like 1/30th of a second, and you can, say for example, use cars going by your driveway. Maybe people you know, so you don't freak out strangers, but so if you have a car going by, you can put your camera on a slower shutter speed, like for example 1/30th of a second, and track the vehicle as they're moving. Move with them and see what the result is. You can try it at different shutter speeds as well. You can try it even slower than 1/30th of a second. The problem is the slower that you go, the more you are moving around, and the more your subject, your car or your motorcycle, whatever the case, is going to be a little bit blurry, but it's still a really fun experiment to try. Another really cool thing that you can use a slow shutter speed for is pictures of moving water. So if you've ever seen a picture of a waterfall where the water just looks like clouds or silk, it's so smooth it doesn't even look real. You can't see individual water droplets. That's achieved with a very slow shutter speed, like for example 1/8th of a second. This shutter speed is going to be too slow to hand hold. You're going to need a tripod. If you set your camera on a tripod or other flat stationary surface and point it towards the waterfall, for example, or it can be a brook or a hose, literally any running water will work, and set your shutter speed to about 1/8th of a second. So the rocks and trees and everything stationary is going to be nice and sharp, no blur. But the water, because the water is constantly moving, is going to be recorded as blur, and the result is going to be that really neat effect. So what do we use the very slowest shutter speeds for? You can use it for things like fireworks or star trails, nighttime photography. Have you ever seen people writing their names with sparklers? That's done with a really slow shutter speed. Anytime you're going to use these slow shutter speeds, you're going to have to stabilize your camera. So, for example, use a tripod. With really, really slow shutter speeds, even the act of pushing the shutter button is enough to shake your camera slightly. So a lot of people will use a remote to remotely fire the shutter so that they don't even have to touch the camera. Okay, so to summarize, really, really fast shutter speeds are going to be great for fast-moving objects, but they're not letting in very much light, so you are going to have to brighten up your image in other ways. The mid-range shutter speeds are kind of a good compromise. They're fast enough that you can freeze everything but the fastest motion, but they're also slow enough that they're letting enough light into your camera to expose your picture properly. And slow shutter speeds are good for creating an effect. So you can use them to create that motion blur for moving objects. You can use them to create that soft water effect, fireworks, things like that. Shutter speed experiments are really easy to do in your home. If your camera has a mode dial like this where you can change the shooting mode, put it in shutter priority. That's usually listed with an S, sometimes with a TV. It's really, I know, it stands for time value. I know why they couldn't just stick to S for shutter across the board, but anyway. Put it in shutter priority mode. What shutter priority mode does is you set the shutter speed and the camera will figure out everything else. It will pick the aperture size and the ISO that you're going to need to expose your image correctly with the shutter speed you chose. Set your camera up in front of something that's moving. So it can be a fan, it could be water coming out of your faucet, really anything that's got some consistent motion to it. Using your camera in shutter priority mode, set your camera to several different shutter speeds and take as many pictures as you want and compare them. So the faster shutter speeds, like say 1/1000th of a second, they're going to stop the motion. Slower shutter speeds, you're going to start to see a little bit of blur, a little bit more blur, until you can't even see a single object, like a fan blade. All you can see is one big blur. Okay, we're going to try an experiment to see shutter speed in action. I'm set up here in my bathroom, and I'm going to take pictures of the water coming out of the faucet. I have the black towel there because I tried this experiment yesterday with just the white tub, and it was really hard to see the differences in the water stream because there wasn't a lot of contrast between the water and the white of the tub. So if you're doing the same thing, if you want to try this at home, you can try it without the towel. You might have better luck than I did, but that's why it's there. If you want to, also, you can try this experiment with your kitchen sink or your bathroom sink or your fan, anything really that's going to give you some motion. So I've got my camera set up here on a tripod, and I've got my mode dial on TV. So for me, that is my shutter priority mode. Yours might be called S. So over here on my display, you can see that I've chosen a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. I've got my ISO set to auto, and it's not currently displaying an aperture because I have not compressed the shutter button yet. But if I do have compressed the shutter button, you'll see it's choosing for me an ISO of 1600 and an aperture of f5, which is currently, with the lens that I'm using, my maximum aperture, with the lens and the focal length, I should say. So I'm going to start the water. I'm going to take pictures at 4 or 5 different shutter speeds, and we're going to compare the results. Okay, so we've got the water running. Camera is set up, as I showed you before, on 1/250th of a second. It's choosing a 1600 ISO and an f5 aperture. This is the result. You can see lots of individual water droplets here. So we're going to try it again, slowing down the shutter speed to about 1/30th of a second. You can see where it also changes the ISO that it picked. The resulting picture is a lot smoother. There are fewer individual water droplets that you can see. Slowing down once again. This time we're going to go very, very slow to 1/8 of a second. And now you can really start to see the soft water effect. There are absolutely no individual water droplets in this image. So one more, again, you can see the little quotation marks. That means that we are into 1 full second. And here's the result. Absolutely smooth. You can see that there's really no individual water droplets there at all. This is how you would get that very, very smooth look if you were taking pictures of a waterfall, for example. I hope that was helpful. As always, reach out if you have any questions. Let me know if you have a request for the next video, and I will see you soon. Bye.